Now we're going to explore why you wouldn't last a day in colonial America, and how the brutal reality of early American life was far different from the romantic stories we often hear about brave pioneers and founding fathers. When most people think about colonial America, they imagine brave settlers building a new nation, Thanksgiving dinners with friendly Native Americans, and hardy pioneers carving civilization out of the wilderness. These romantic images fill our history books and popular culture, creating a myth of colonial America as a land of opportunity and adventure. The reality was far different and infinitely more brutal. Colonial America was a death trap where the vast majority of people who attempted to settle there died within their first few years. It was a place where starvation was common, disease was rampant, violence was constant, and death lurked around every corner. If you had been born in colonial America between 1600 and 1750, your chances of surviving to adulthood would have been less than 50%. If you had been among the first settlers at Jamestown, your chances of surviving your first year would have been less than 10%. These were not pioneering adventures. They were desperate struggles for survival under condition that would challenge even modern survival experts. The colonists who came to America faced challenges that were in many ways worse than those faced by medieval peasants in Europe. At least medieval peasants lived in established communities with centuries of accumulated knowledge about local conditions, available food sources, and survival techniques. The American colonists were thrown into a completely alien environment with no knowledge of local conditions, facing hostile climate, unfamiliar diseases, dangerous wildlife, and often hostile relations with Native American tribes. Your average day in colonial America would begin before dawn, not with the comfortable routine of modern life, but with the immediate concern of whether you would have enough food to eat that day, whether you would stay warm enough to survive another night, and whether you would avoid the diseases, accidents, or violence that could end your life at any moment. Colonial Americans lived in constant fear of starvation. Unlike modern Americans who can simply go to a store when they need food, colonial settlers had to grow, gather, hunt, or trade for every morsel they consumed. A single bad harvest, a harsh winter, or a disruption in trade could mean death by starvation for entire communities. They lived in constant fear of disease. Colonial America was swept by regular epidemics of smallpox, typhus, yellow fever, dysentery, and other killer diseases. These epidemics could kill half the population of a town in a matter of weeks. Medical knowledge was primitive, and treatments were often more dangerous than the diseases themselves. They lived in constant fear of violence. Relations with Native American tribes were frequently hostile, and conflicts could erupt into brutal warfare with torture, scalping, and mass killings on both sides. Colonial justice was harsh and arbitrary. with public executions for minor crimes and accusations of witchcraft leading to torture and death. They lived in constant fear of the elements. Colonial homes provided minimal protection from harsh weather. Winters could be deadly, with families freezing to death in their own homes. Summers brought swarms of disease, carrying insects, and the constant threat of drought. The work required to survive in colonial America was backbreaking and constant. From dawn to dusk, every day was filled with the hard physical labor necessary to secure food, shelter, and basic necessities. There was no time for leisure, no safety net if you became sick or injured, and no guarantee that all your hard work would be enough to keep you alive. Women in colonial America faced additional dangers and hardships. Childbirth was extremely dangerous, with many women dying in labor or from complications afterward. Those who survived childbirth could expect to spend most of their adult lives pregnant, caring for children, and performing the countless domestic tasks necessary for family survival. Children in colonial America faced a grim reality. Many died in their first year of life from disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Those who survived childhood were put to work at early ages, contributing to family survival through farm labor, domestic work, or dangerous trades. The romanticized image of colonial America as a land of freedom and opportunity was true only for a small elite. The vast majority of colonial settlers lived lives of grinding poverty, constant danger, and early death. Many came to America not as free settlers, but as indentured servants, bound to years of unpaid labor, under conditions that were often worse than slavery. As we explore the specific horrors of colonial life, remember that these were not distant historical curiosities, but the daily reality faced by hundreds of thousands of people who tried to build new lives in America. Their struggles, their suffering, and their frequent deaths were the foundation upon which modern American prosperity was eventually built. The comfortable life you live today, with abundant food, safe shelter, modern medicine, and protection from violence, would have seemed like an impossible dream to the vast majority of people who lived in colonial America. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your safe, warm bed, remember the countless colonial Americans who died cold, hungry, and afraid in the wilderness they tried to tame. The story of Jamestown, Virginia, established in 1607 as the first permanent English settlement in America, is one of the most horrific survival stories in human history. What happened at Jamestown in its first decades reveals the true brutality of early colonial American life and shows just how close the entire English colonial enterprise came to complete failure. When the first 104 English settlers arrived at Jamestown in May 1607, they had no idea they were sailing into what would become known as one of the deadliest places on earth. By January 1608, just 8 months later, only 38 of the original settlers were still alive. The others had died from starvation, disease, violence, countless other dangers that made Jamestown a death trap. The location chosen for Jamestown was a disaster from the beginning. The settlers selected a site on the James River that they thought would be easy to defend, but this location was actually a swampy peninsula with brackish water, poor soil, and an unhealthy climate that bred disease, carrying mosquitoes. The water they drank was contaminated with salt and human waste, leading to dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that killed settlers within days of their arrival. The settlers who came to Jamestown were poorly prepared for the realities of colonial life. Many were gentlemen who had never performed manual labor, expecting to find gold and easy wealth rather than the backbreaking work necessary for survival. Others were craftsmen whose skills were useless in the wilderness, goldsmiths, perfumers, and other luxury trade workers who had no knowledge of farming, hunting, or basic survival techniques. Food became scarce almost immediately. The settlers had brought limited supplies from England, expecting to be able to trade with local Native Americans or find abundant natural food sources. Instead, they found themselves in a landscape they didn't understand, unable to identify edible plants, unsuccessful at hunting unfamiliar game, and increasingly desperate as their supplies ran out. The relationship with the local Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan, was complex and often hostile. While there were periods of trade and cooperation, there were also periods of warfare and siege. The Powhatan sometimes provided corn and other food to the starving colonists, but they also recognized that the English represented a threat to their way of life and their control over the land. As food supplies dwindled, the settlers began to experience the effects of malnutrition and starvation. Their bodies began to consume their own muscle and fat reserves. They became weak, unable to perform the work necessary for survival. Their immune systems weakened, making them more susceptible to disease. Many developed scurvy from lack of vitamin C, causing their teeth to fall out, their gums to bleed, and painful sores to develop all over their bodies. The winter of 1609-1610 became known as the starving time, when the colony nearly died out completely. The settlers had failed to plant adequate crops. Their stored food had spoiled or been consumed, and a siege by the Powhatans cut off access to native food sources. The colonists began eating anything they could find: leather, dogs, cats, rats, and even human excrement in their desperation. Archaeological evidence from Jamestown has revealed the horrific reality of what happened during the starving time. Researchers have found human bones with knife marks, clear evidence that the starving colonists resorted to cannibalism to survive. They ate the flesh of colonists who had died from disease or starvation, and there is evidence that they may have killed weaker colonists to feed the stronger ones. One documented case from the starving time tells of a colonist who killed his pregnant wife removed the unborn child from her womb and salted her flesh to preserve it for food. When this was discovered, the man was tortured and executed, but his actions reveal the depths of desperation reached by the starving colonists. The colonists ate tree bark, trying to extract any nutritional value from the woody fibers. They ate shoe leather, boiling it for hours to make it soft enough to chew and swallow. They ate the starch used to stiffen their collars and cuffs. They ate anything and everything in a desperate attempt to stay alive. By the end of the starving time, only 60 colonists remained alive out of the 500 who had been in Jamestown when winter began. These survivors were skeletal, diseased, and barely alive. They had been reduced to a primitive struggle for existence that stripped away all pretense of civilization. The survivors of the starving time described conditions that sound like something from a horror movie. Bodies lay unburied in the streets because the living were too weak to dig graves. Disease ran rampant through the weakened population. The smell of death and decay filled the air. Those who were still alive wandered around like ghosts, searching desperately for anything edible. Even after the starving time ended, death continued to stalk Jamestown. New shipments of colonists from England would arrive, only to die within months from disease, starvation, or violence. Between 1607 and 1624, approximately 300 English colonists came to Virginia. Of these, only about 200 were still alive in 1624. The death rate was over 80%. The diseases that killed colonists at Jamestown were numerous and deadly. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, killed colonists through severe dehydration from constant dire heat and vomiting. Typhoid fever caused high fevers, severe headaches, and death within weeks. Malaria, spread by mosquitoes in the swampy environment, caused cyclical fevers and gradual weakening until death. Scurvy was common among colonists who had no access to fresh fruits and vegetables. This vitamin C deficiency caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, painful joints, and eventually death. The colonists had no understanding of nutrition and didn't know that fresh plant foods could prevent this disease. Salt poisoning was another killer at Jamestown. The brackish water of the James River contained high levels of salt, and colonists who drank this water regularly developed salt poisoning, which caused kidney failure, seizures, and death. The colonists had no way to purify their water and no alternative sources of drinking water. The work required to survive at Jamestown was overwhelming for colonists who were already weakened by hunger and disease. They had to build shelters with hand tools, clear land for farming, plant and tend crops, hunt for food, maintain fortifications, and perform all the other tasks necessary for survival. This work had to be done despite inadequate food, constant illness, and the ever-present threat of attack. The shelters at Jamestown provided minimal protection from the elements. Early colonists lived in tents and crude wooden structures that leaked in rain, provided little warmth in winter, and offered no protection from insects in summer. Many colonists died of exposure, freezing to death in their own beds during harsh Virginia winters. The tools and supplies available to Jamestown colonists were inadequate for their needs. They had basic hand tools, but no machinery, no livestock for farming, and limited building materials. Everything had to be done through manual labor under primitive conditions. Medical care at Jamestown was virtually non-existent. There were no trained doctors, no medicines, and no understanding of how to treat the diseases that were killing colonists. The few medical treatments that were attempted often made patients worse rather than better. Injuries that would be minor today were often fatal at Jamestown. A broken bone, a deep cut, or a burn could lead to infection and death. There were no antibiotics, no proper surgical techniques, and no way to treat serious injuries. The psychological stress of life at Jamestown was immense. Colonists watched friends and family members die around them, never knowing if they would be next. They lived in constant fear of starvation, disease, and attack. Many colonists suffered what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. The social structure at Jamestown broke down under the pressure of survival. Class distinctions that had been important in England became meaningless when everyone was struggling to stay alive. Gentlemen found themselves doing manual labor, while servants sometimes found themselves in positions of authority if they had useful skills. The economic expectations that had motivated many colonists to come to Virginia proved to be completely unrealistic. Instead of finding gold and easy wealth, they found only hard work, constant danger, and early death. The Virginia Company that had sponsored the colony lost enormous of money as shipment after shipment of colonists died shortly after arriving. The relationships between colonists at Jamestown were strained by the constant pressure of survival. There were conflicts over food distribution, work assignments, and leadership decisions. Some colonists accused others of hoarding food or shirking their share of work. In the desperate struggle for survival, cooperation sometimes gave way to selfishness and conflict. The few colonists who survived long enough to establish successful farms and families at Jamestown did so only after years of struggle and hardship that would be unimaginable to modern Americans. They had to learn through trial and error how to grow crops in Virginia soil, how to preserve food through hot summers and cold winters, and how to defend themselves against both disease and violence. The children born at Jamestown faced even worse odds than the adult colonists. Infant mortality was extremely high, with most babies dying in their first year of life. Those who survived childhood grew up in an environment of constant danger and scarcity, with little education and few opportunities beyond the basic struggle for survival. The women at Jamestown faced particular hardships. In addition to all the dangers faced by male colonists, women had to deal with the extreme dangers of pregnancy and childbirth without medical care. Many women died in labor or from complications afterward. Those who survived repeated pregnancies were often physically broken by the strain. The story of Jamestown is a story of human endurance pushed to its absolute limits. The colonists who survived did so through a combination of luck, determination, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge about how to live in their new environment. But for every colonist who survived, many others died horrible deaths from starvation, disease, violence, or exposure. The horrors of Jamestown were not unique among early American settlements. Similar death rates and survival challenges faced colonists throughout early America. The romanticized image of brave pioneers building a new nation obscures the reality that early American colonization was a demographic disaster, with death rates that rivaled those of major plagues or wars. As we move on to examine other aspects of colonial American life, remember the Jamestown experience was not an isolated tragedy, but rather a typical example of what awaited anyone who tried to build a life in colonial America. The comfortable distance of centuries makes it easy to forget that these were real people with hopes and dreams much like our own, who died in agony and terror far from their homes. The story of Plymouth Colony, established by the Pilgrims in 1620, has been romanticized in American culture as a tale of religious freedom, cooperation with Native Americans, and the first Thanksgiving. The reality of life at Plymouth was far more brutal, with death nearly as horrific as those at Jamestown, and suffering that would make your comfortable modern life seem like an impossible luxury. When the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth Rock in November 1620, carrying 102 pilgrims seeking religious freedom, they were already weakened by a voyage that had taken longer than expected and had been marked by disease, inadequate food, and cramped living conditions aboard ship. What they found in Massachusetts was not the promised land they had hoped for, but a harsh wilderness entering winter with no adequate shelter, no stored food, and no knowledge of how to survive in their new environment. The Pilgrims had originally intended to settle in Virginia, where the climate would have been milder and where they might have received some assistance from the established Jamestown colony. Instead, they found themselves much farther north, facing a New England winter that would prove deadly for more than half of their number. The first winter at Plymouth from 1620 to 1621 killed 50 of the original 102 colonists. This death rate of nearly 50% was achieved despite the fact that the Pilgrims were better organized and more religiously motivated than many other colonial groups. Death came from a combination of scurvy, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other diseases, complicated by malnutrition, exposure to cold, and the enormous physical stress of trying to build a settlement from nothing in the middle of winter. Pilgrims faced immediate problems that threatened their survival from the moment they landed. They had arrived too late in the year to plant crops, so they had no prospect of fresh food until the following year. Their supplies from England were limited and already partially spoiled from the long voyage. They had to build shelter immediately, but they had only basic hand tools and no knowledge of local building materials or techniques. The first shelters built at Plymouth were crude dugouts and huts that provided minimal protection from the harsh New England winter. These structures were built partially underground for insulation, but they were damp, poorly ventilated, and breeding grounds for disease. Families crowded together in spaces barely large enough for a few people, with no privacy and no escape from the illnesses that spread rapidly through the close quarters. Scurvy was one of the major killers during that first winter. This disease, caused by lack of vitamin C, caused the Pilgrims' teeth to fall out, their gums to bleed continuously, painful sores to develop all over their bodies, and eventually death from internal bleeding. The Pilgrims had no fresh fruits or vegetables, relying instead on salted meat and grain that provided no protection against the scurvy. The symptoms of scurvy were horrific and demoralizing. Victims became extremely weak, unable to perform the work necessary for survival. Their breath became full from bleeding gums and rotting teeth. Their skin became covered with painful bruises and sores that wouldn't heal. Eventually, they died from internal hemorrhaging, bleeding to death inside their own bodies. Pneumonia was another major killer, as the cold, damp conditions in their primitive shelters provided perfect conditions for respiratory infections. Pilgrims developed severe coughs, high fevers, and difficulty breathing. Without modern medical care, pneumonia was often fatal, with victims slowly drowning in their own lung fluids. Tuberculosis spread rapidly through the crowded living conditions at Plymouth. This bacterial infection attacked the lungs, causing persistent coughing, fever, weight loss, and eventually death. Victims would cough up blood, their bodies would waste away, and they would die slowly over a period of months. The disease was highly contagious, spreading from person to person through the air in their cramped shelters. The work required to survive at Plymouth was overwhelming for colonists who were already weakened by disease and malnutrition. They had to chop down trees with hand axes to build shelters and clear land for farming. They had to dig wells for water, build fortifications for defense, hunt for game in unfamiliar forests, and gather whatever wild foods they could find in the harsh New England landscape. This work had to be performed despite bitter cold, deep snow, and the constant threat of attack from local Native American tribes. The Pilgrims were not experienced woodsmen or farmers. Many were tradesmen and artisans from English cities who had never lived off the land. They had to learn through trial and error how to survive in a wilderness environment and many died in the process of learning. Food scarcity was a constant problem at Plymouth. The colonists had brought limited supplies from England, and these were quickly consumed or spoiled. They knew little about local food sources and were often unable to successfully hunt or gather enough food to meet their needs. Meals were small and infrequent, consisting mainly of whatever grain remained from their original supplies, supplemented by whatever game or wild plants they could find. The Pilgrims ate bark from trees, trying to extract nutrients from woody fibers. They ate acorns, though these required extensive processing to remove bitter tannins before they could be consumed safely. They ate whatever small game they could catch, squirrels, rabbits, birds, but their hunting success was limited by their lack of experience and inadequate weapons. Water was another constant problem. The Pilgrims had to dig wells by hand, often striking brackish water that was barely drinkable. They had no way to purify contaminated water, so waterborne diseases were common. During winter, their water sources sometimes froze, forcing them to melt snow and ice for drinking water. The cold was relentless and life-threatening. New England winters were far harsher than anything most of the Pilgrims had experienced in England. Their primitive shelters provided inadequate heating, and they had limited supplies of firewood. Many colonists suffered from frostbite, losing fingers and toes to the cold. Some froze to death in their beds during the coldest nights. The Pilgrims had to maintain fires constantly for warmth and cooking, but gathering firewood was dangerous and exhausting work. They had to venture into the forest with axes, cut down trees, and drag heavy logs back to their settlement. This work was difficult for healthy men, but it became nearly impossible for colonists who were weakened by disease and malnutrition. Clothing was inadequate for the harsh conditions. The Pilgrims had brought English clothing suitable for a milder climate, and they had no knowledge of how to make clothing suitable for New England winters. Their woolen garments became wet from snow and rain, and wet wool provided little insulation against the cold. Many colonists suffered from hypothermia, their body temperatures dropping dangerously low as they lost the ability to stay warm. Medical care at Plymouth was primitive and often dangerous. The colonists had limited medical supplies and no trained physicians. They treated diseases with bloodletting, which weakened patients who were already weak from illness. They used herbal remedies that were often ineffective or even harmful. Many colonists died from treatments that were intended to help them. Injuries that would be minor today were often fatal at Plymouth. A broken bone could mean permanent disability or death from infection. Deep cuts often became infected without proper cleaning and bandaging. Burns from cooking fires could become infected and lead to death from blood poisoning. The psychological stress of life at Plymouth was enormous. Colonists watched family members and friends die around them, knowing that they might be next. They lived in constant fear of starvation, disease, attack, and death. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. Children at Plymouth faced terrible odds. Many died in their first year of life from disease, malnutrition, or exposure to cold. Those who survived had to contribute to family survival from an early age, performing adult work despite their small size and limited strength. Childhood as we understand it today simply didn't exist at Plymouth. The women at Plymouth faced all the same dangers as the men, plus the additional risks of pregnancy and childbirth without medical care. Many women died in labor or from complications afterward. Those who survived repeated pregnancies were often physically broken by the combination of childbearing and the harsh conditions of colonial life. The famous First Thanksgiving of 1621 was indeed a real event, but it was not the happy celebration depicted in modern mythology. It was a brief moment of relief during a period of constant struggle and death. The cooperation with local Native Americans, particularly the Wampanoag tribe led by Chief Massasoit, was essential for Plymouth's survival, but it was also temporary and would eventually give way to conflict and warfare. The Native Americans who helped the Plymouth colonists were themselves dealing with the devastating effects of diseases brought by earlier European explorers. Entire villages had been wiped out by smallpox and other diseases, leaving the Wampanoag weakened and in need of allies. Their assistance to the Pilgrims was based on practical political considerations rather than simple friendship. Even with Native American assistance, Plymouth remained a dangerous place where death was always near. The colony grew slowly, and new arrivals continued to die at high rates during their first years in America. It took decades for Plymouth to become a stable community where residents could expect to live to old age. The religious motivation that had brought the Pilgrims to America provided some psychological comfort during their suffering, but it did not protect them from the physical realities of disease, starvation, and exposure. Many pilgrims interpreted their suffering as a test from God, which may have helped them endure hardships that might otherwise have broken their spirits. The economic realities of Plymouth were harsh. The colonists had invested their life savings in the journey to America, expecting to find prosperity in the New World. Instead, they found only hard work, constant danger, and minimal return on their investment. Many families lost everything they owned and died in poverty despite their enormous efforts. The social structure at Plymouth was strained by the constant pressure of survival. Religious unity helped hold the community together, but there were still conflicts over work assignments, food distribution, and leadership decisions. The democratic ideals that the Pilgrims brought with them were tested by the harsh realities of survival in a hostile environment. The few colonists who survived and thrived at Plymouth did so only after years of struggle that would be unimaginable to modern Americans. They learned through bitter experience how to grow crops in New England soil, how to preserve food through harsh winters, and how to build shelters that could withstand the climate. But for every colonist who succeeded, others died in the attempt. The Plymouth experience was repeated throughout New England as other Puritan and separatist groups attempted to establish settlements. Death rates remained high, and survival required constant struggle against disease, starvation, and the elements. The romantic image of hardy pioneers building a city upon a hill obscures the reality that early New England colonization was a demographic disaster. The legacy of Plymouth has been sanitized and romanticized in American culture, but the reality was far more brutal. The pilgrims who survived did so through a combination of religious faith, community cooperation, Native American assistance, and sheer luck, but they also survived by watching half their number die during that first winter, and by enduring hardships that would break most modern people. As we continue our examination of colonial American life, remember that the Plymouth story, like the Jamestown story, represents the typical experience of early American colonization rather than an exceptional case. The comfortable lives we lead today were built on the bones of colonists who died in agony and terror, far from their homes, in pursuit of dreams that most of them never lived to see fulfilled. Disease was the greatest killer in colonial America, claiming more lives than warfare, starvation, or accidents. The colonial period was marked by repeated epidemics that swept through communities, killing thousands and leaving survivors traumatized and weakened. If you had lived in colonial America, disease would have been your most likely cause of death, and the medical treatments available would often have been worse than the diseases themselves. The diseases that plagued colonial America were numerous, deadly, and poorly understood. Smallpox, typhus, yellow fever, dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and dozens of other infectious diseases swept through colonial communities with devastating regularity. These epidemics could kill 30 to 50% of a town's population in a matter of weeks, leaving entire communities devastated. Smallpox was perhaps the most feared disease in colonial America. This viral infection caused high fever, severe body aches, and a distinctive rash that covered the entire body with fluid-filled blisters. Victims suffered through days of agony as the blisters formed, filled with pus, and eventually scabbed over. Many victims died from the high fever or from secondary infections. Those who survived were often left with deep scars covering their faces and bodies. Smallpox epidemics struck colonial communities repeatedly throughout the colonial period. A typical smallpox outbreak would begin when an infected person arrived in town, perhaps a sailor from a merchant ship or a traveler from another colony. Within days, other people would begin showing symptoms. Within weeks, the disease would spread through the entire community. The progression of a smallpox epidemic was terrifying to watch. First, a few people would develop fever and body aches. Then, the characteristic rash would appear, starting on the face and spreading across the entire body. Victims would become delirious from fever, their faces swollen beyond recognition from the blisters. Many would die within a week of developing symptoms. The social disruption caused by smallpox epidemics was enormous. Normal life would come to a halt as people became too sick to work, trade, or care for their families. Markets would close, ships would refuse to enter infected ports, and communication between communities would break down. Entire families would die, leaving children orphaned and property abandoned. Yellow fever was another devastating killer, particularly in southern colonies and port cities. This disease was transmitted by mosquitoes and caused high fever, severe headaches, and yellowing of the skin as the liver failed. Victims would vomit black blood as their internal organs shut down. Death rates during yellow fever epidemics often exceeded 50%. Yellow fever epidemics were particularly devastating in cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, where the disease would arrive on ships from the Caribbean and spread rapidly through the crowded population. During the 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, approximately 5,000 people died out of a population of 50,000. The city became a ghost town as those who could afford to do so fled to the countryside. The symptoms of yellow fever were horrible to witness. Victims developed high fevers that would spike suddenly, causing delirium and seizures. Their skin would turn yellow as their liver failed to process toxins from their blood. They would vomit blood that had turned black from internal bleeding. Many victims died within days of developing symptoms, while others lingered for weeks in agony before finally succumbing. Typhus was a bacterial infection spread by body lice that thrived in the poor sanitary conditions common in colonial towns. The disease caused high fever, severe headaches, and a distinctive rash that spread across the body. Victims often became delirious, and death rates were high, particularly among the poor who lived in overcrowded conditions where lice could spread easily. Typhus epidemics were often associated with overcrowding, poor hygiene, and poverty. The disease would spread rapidly through jails, ships, and poor neighborhoods where people lived in close quarters without adequate washing facilities. During times of war or economic hardship, when normal sanitary practices broke down, typhus epidemics could kill thousands. The progression of typhus was marked by increasingly severe symptoms. Victims would develop intense headaches that felt like their heads were splitting open. High fevers would cause delirium and hallucinations. A red rash would spread across their bodies, starting on their chests and spreading to their arms and legs. Many victims died within 2 weeks of infection. Dysentery was a constant threat in colonial communities, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation. This bacterial infection attacked the intestines, causing severe diarrhea, bloody stools, and dehydration. Victims would lose enormous amounts of fluid and electrolytes, leading to weakness, kidney failure, and death. The symptoms of dysentery were both painful and embarrassing. Victims would have to relieve themselves constantly, often producing bloody stools that contained pus and mucus. They would become severely dehydrated, their skin becoming dry and their eyes sunken. Cramping, abdominal pain would be constant and severe. Many victims died from dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Dysentery was particularly dangerous for children and elderly people whose bodies were less able to cope with fluid loss. During dysentery outbreaks, entire families would become sick simultaneously, making it difficult for anyone to care for the others. The disease would spread rapidly through communities that shared water sources or had poor waste disposal systems. Malaria was endemic in many parts of colonial America, particularly in the southern colonies, where the climate was suitable for the mosquitoes that transmitted the disease. This parasitic infection caused cyclical fevers, chills, and gradual weakening that could eventually lead to death. Many colonists suffered from chronic malaria for years, experiencing periodic episodes of fever and weakness. The symptoms of malaria would come in cycles, with victims experiencing periods of intense fever and chills followed by periods of relative wellness. During fever episodes, victims would experience temperatures 104 degrees or higher, causing delirium and seizures. They would shiver uncontrollably even while burning with fever. Over time, repeated episodes would weaken victims until they died from the cumulative effects of the disease. Tuberculosis was a slow killer that infected the lungs and caused persistent coughing, weight loss, and gradual wasting away. Victims would cough up blood and slowly lose weight until they resembled skeletons. The disease was highly contagious and spread easily through the close quarters in which colonial families lived. The progression of tuberculosis was slow and agonizing. Victims would develop a persistent cough that gradually worsened over months or years. They would begin coughing up blood, sometimes in large quantities. They would lose weight steadily, their bodies consuming their own muscle and fat reserves. Eventually, they would become too weak to leave their beds, dying slowly from lung failure and starvation. Diphtheria was particularly deadly for children, causing severe throat infections that could block breathing. Victims would develop a thick, gray membrane in their throats that could suffocate them. Even those who survived often suffered permanent damage to their hearts and nervous systems. The symptoms of diphtheria were terrifying for parents to witness. Children would develop sore throats that quickly worsened, making it difficult to swallow or breathe. a gray membrane would form in their throats, gradually blocking their airways. Many children would die from suffocation as the membrane completely blocked their breathing passages. Scarlet fever was another childhood killer that caused high fever, sore throat, and a distinctive red rash. The disease could lead to serious complications affecting the heart, kidneys, and brain. Many children who survived scarlet fever were left with permanent disabilities. Medical knowledge in colonial America was primitive and often dangerous. Doctors had no understanding of germs or how diseases spread. They believed in the miasma theory, which held that diseases were caused by bad air or evil vapors. This misunderstanding led to treatments that were often worse than the diseases themselves. Bloodletting was the most common medical treatment for almost any disease. Doctors would open veins and drain large quantities of blood from patients, believing this would restore the balance of bodily humors. In reality, bloodletting weakened patients who were already fighting serious infections, often hastening their deaths. The tools used for bloodletting were crude and often unsanitary. Doctors used lancets to open veins or applied leeches to drain blood from patients. These instruments were rarely cleaned properly between patients, spreading infections from one person to another. Many patients died from infections contracted during medical treatment rather than from their original diseases. Purging was another common treatment that involved giving patients powerful laxatives to empty their bowels. Doctors believed this would rid the body of disease causing toxins. In reality, purging caused severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances that often killed patients who might have survived their original illnesses. Mercury was commonly used to treat various diseases, particularly syphilis and other infections. Patients were given mercury in pills, ointments, or vapor treatments. Mercury is highly toxic, and these treatments often caused mercury poisoning, which could be more deadly than the original disease. Symptoms of mercury poisoning included loss of teeth, kidney failure, brain damage, and death. Opium was used to treat pain and help patients sleep, but it was often given in dangerous doses that could cause addiction or death from overdose. Many patients became dependent on opium and died from the effects of long-term use. Colonial surgery was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper understanding of anatomy. Patients had to endure surgery while fully conscious, often dying from shock, blood loss, or infection. Simple procedures that would be routine today were often fatal in colonial times. Amputation was sometimes necessary for serious injuries or infections, but it was performed without pain relief and with crude instruments. Patients had to be held down while surgeons sawed through bone and flesh. Many patients died from the shock of the procedure or from infections that developed afterward. Dental care was primitive and often more harmful than helpful. Tooth extraction was performed without anesthesia, using crude pliers or other tools. Many people died from infections that developed after dental procedures. Dental problems were common and often led to serious health complications. Pregnancy and childbirth were extremely dangerous for women in colonial America. Many women died during labor or from complications afterward. Midwives had limited knowledge and few tools to help with difficult births. Complications such as bleeding, infection, or obstructed labor were often fatal. Infant mortality was extremely high, with many babies dying in their first year of life from various diseases, malnutrition, or birth defects. Families expected to lose several children and often didn't name babies until they were sure the children would survive their first few months. The psychological impact of living with constant disease and death was enormous. Colonial Americans lived in perpetual fear of becoming sick, knowing that any illness could be fatal. They watched family members and friends die regularly, often after prolonged suffering. This constant exposure to death and suffering shaped colonial culture and contributed to the fatalistic attitudes that were common during this period. Quarantine measures were sometimes attempted during epidemics, but they were often ineffective due to poor understanding of how diseases spread. Infected families would be sealed in their homes, sometimes dying alone without care. Ships suspected of carrying disease would be turned away from ports, often resulting in the deaths of everyone aboard. The economic impact of disease epidemics was severe. Trade would stop during outbreaks. Crops would rot in fields as farmers became too sick to harvest them, and entire communities would be economically devastated. Recovery from major epidemics could take years or decades. Religious interpretations of disease varied, but many colonists viewed epidemics as punishment from God for individual or community sins. This belief sometimes prevented rational responses to disease outbreaks and added psychological torment to physical suffering. The few medical remedies that were actually effective were often based on traditional folk knowledge rather than formal medical training. Willow bark tea contained salicin, which had anti-inflammatory properties similar to aspirin. Some herbal remedies did provide limited relief from symptoms, though they rarely cured serious diseases. Prevention of disease was limited by poor understanding of transmission mechanisms. Colonial Americans had no knowledge of germs, so they couldn't take effective steps to prevent the spread of infectious diseases. Sanitation practices were poor, water supplies were often contaminated, and overcrowding provided ideal conditions for disease transmission. The colonial experience with disease shaped American attitudes toward medicine and health for generations. The constant threat of epidemic disease contributed to the development of public health measures, though these wouldn't become truly effective until the understanding of germ theory in the 19th century. As we continue examining other aspects of colonial life, remember that disease was the constant backdrop against which all other colonial experiences took place. Every colonial American lived with the knowledge that disease could strike at any time, kill quickly or slowly, and devastate entire communities. The comfortable assumption of good health that modern Americans take for granted was a luxury unknown to the colonial population. Relations between European colonists and Native American tribes were complex, often cooperative, but frequently erupted into brutal warfare that devastated both sides. If you had lived on the colonial frontier, the constant threat of violent conflict with Native Americans would have shaped every aspect of your daily life, from where you built your home to how you worked your fields to how you slept at night. The popular image of colonial Indian relations has been romanticized in American culture, with stories of peaceful cooperation like the first Thanksgiving or the friendship between Pocahontas and John Smith. While there were indeed periods of trade and cooperation, the overall pattern of colonial Indian relations was marked by misunderstanding, distrust, and recurring cycles of violence that claimed thousands of lives on both sides. The fundamental source of conflict was competition for land. European colonists needed large amounts of land for farming, town building, and expansion, while Native American tribes had their own territorial boundaries, hunting grounds, and sacred sites that they were determined to protect. These competing claims to the same land made long-term peaceful coexistence extremely difficult. Cultural misunderstandings made conflicts worse. Europeans and Native Americans had completely different concepts of land ownership, political authority, and appropriate responses to conflicts. What one side saw as legitimate self-defense, the other often viewed as unprovoked aggression. These misunderstandings led to escalating cycles of violence that were difficult to stop once they began. The warfare that resulted from these conflicts was brutal and terrifying for colonial settlers. Native American warfare traditionally emphasized surprise attacks, psychological warfare, and the taking of captives rather than the formal battlefield encounters that Europeans were accustomed to. Colonial settlements were vulnerable to sudden raids that could wipe out entire families or communities. A typical Indian raid on a colonial settlement would begin before dawn, when the attackers could approach under cover of darkness. Warriors would surround isolated farmhouses or small settlements, then attack simultaneously from multiple directions. The goal was often to capture prisoners, particularly women and children, who could be adopted into the tribe or used for ransom. The weapons used in these conflicts were deadly and designed to inflict maximum damage. Native American warriors were skilled with bows and arrows, tomahawks, war clubs, and knives. They could fire arrows with deadly accuracy at ranges that made colonial firearms ineffective. Tomahawks could split skulls with a single blow, while war clubs could crush bones and cause internal injuries that led to slow, agonizing deaths. Scalping was practiced by some tribes as a way of counting cope and demonstrating victory over enemies. This practice involved cutting away the hair and skin from the top of a victim's head, often while the victim was still alive. Many colonial victims survived scalping but were left with horrific injuries and permanent disfigurement. The psychological trauma of scalping was as significant as the physical damage. Torture was sometimes used by both sides in these conflicts, though it was more commonly associated with Native American practices. Captives might be subjected to various forms of torture designed to test their courage and provide entertainment for their captors. These tortures could include burning, cutting, beating, and other forms of physical abuse that could last for hours or days before the victim finally died. Colonial captives who survived torture might be adopted into Native American tribes, particularly if they were women or children. This adoption process involved stripping away their European identity and forcing them to learn Native American languages, customs, and ways of life. Some captives eventually integrated into their new communities, while others never stopped trying to escape back to colonial society. The most famous colonial captivity narrative is that of Mary Rowlandson, who was captured during King Philip's War in 1676 and held prisoner for 11 weeks. Her account of her captivity describes the hardships, fears, and cultural conflicts experienced by colonial captives. Rowlandson witnessed violence, starvation, and forced marches that tested her physical and psychological endurance. Many captives died during the journey to Native American villages, unable to keep up with the pace of travel or succumbing to injuries sustained during their capture. Those who survived the journey faced an uncertain future in communities where they were often viewed with suspicion and had to prove their worth through hard work and adaptation to unfamiliar customs. Colonial military responses to Indian raids were often brutal and indiscriminate. Colonial militias would organize retaliatory expeditions that targeted Native American villages, often killing innocent men, women, and children in revenge for attacks on colonial settlements. These retaliations would then provoke counter-attacks, creating cycles of violence that could continue for years. The Pequot War of 1636-1638 in New England demonstrated the extreme brutality that could characterize colonial Indian conflicts. The war culminated in the Mystic Massacre, where colonial forces surrounded a Pequot village and set it on fire, killing approximately 700 men, women, and children. Even colonial allies among other tribes were horrified by the scale and indiscriminate nature of this violence. King Philip's War, 1675-676, was one of the bloodiest conflicts in colonial American history relative to population size. The war began when Metacomet, as called King Philip by the colonists, leader of the Wampanoag tribe, organized a coalition of tribes to resist colonial expansion in New England. The The conflict devastated both sides, with approximately 3,000 Native Americans and 600 colonists killed out of a total New England population of only about 80,000. During King Philip's War, entire colonial towns were destroyed or abandoned. Settlements like Lancaster, Groton, and Warwick were burned to the ground, their inhabitants killed or captured. The colonial economy was devastated as farms were abandoned. Trade was disrupted, and resources were diverted to military purposes. The war also demonstrated the vulnerability of colonial settlements to coordinated Native American attacks. Despite having superior firearms, colonists found themselves unable to defend against enemies who knew the terrain better, could move silently through forests, and could strike without warning. Many colonists abandoned frontier settlements and retreated to more heavily fortified towns. Frontier life was shaped by the constant threat of attack. Colonial families living on the edges of settlement had to take elaborate precautions to protect themselves. Houses were built like small fortresses with thick walls, few windows, and secure doors that could withstand attack. Many families kept weapons loaded and ready at all times. Colonial farmers working in fields distant from their homes faced constant danger. They often worked in groups for mutual protection and kept weapons nearby while they worked. Many farmers were killed while working alone in isolated areas, their bodies sometimes not found for days or weeks. Children in frontier communities lived with restrictions that would seem unbearable to modern children. They were not allowed to play alone outside, couldn't wander far from home, and had to be constantly alert for signs of danger. Many children were trained to hide at the first sign of potential attack and to run to designated safe areas if their homes were threatened. Women on the frontier faced particular vulnerabilities. They were often left alone with children while their husbands worked or traveled, making them prime targets for raiders. Many women learned to use firearms and other weapons to defend their homes and families. Some became skilled fighters who could hold off attackers until help arrived. The psychological impact of living under constant threat was severe. Frontier colonists developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress and anxiety. They had difficulty sleeping, were constantly vigilant for signs of danger, and often suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder after experiencing or witnessing violent attacks. Colonial military tactics had to adapt to the realities of frontier warfare. European-style formations and battle tactics were ineffective against Native American warriors who used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, and knowledge of local terrain to their advantage. Colonial forces gradually adopted Native American tactics, using rangers and scout units that could operate effectively in forest environments. The economic cost of Indian warfare was enormous for colonial communities. Military expeditions were expensive, requiring supplies weapons and pay for soldiers. Agricultural production suffered when farmers were killers or forced to abandon their fields. Trade was disrupted when transport routes became too dangerous to use. Treaties were sometimes negotiated to end conflicts, but these agreements were often temporary and frequently broken by both sides. Cultural misunderstandings made it difficult to create lasting peace agreements, and new conflicts would often arise over land disputes, trade disagreements, or revenge for past injuries. The French and Indian War in 1754-763 brought European power conflicts into North American Indian warfare. Native American tribes were forced to choose sides between French and British colonists, often fighting against other tribes that had chosen the opposite alliance. This conflict intensified existing tensions and created new sources of violence. During this war, both French and British forces used Native American allies to attack enemy settlements. These attacks often targeted civilian populations and resulted in massacres, captivity, and destruction of entire communities. The scale of violence increased as European military resources were brought to bear in support of Native American warfare tactics. Prisoner exchanges were sometimes negotiated between colonial authorities and Native American tribes. But these negotiations were complex and often unsuccessful. Many captives had been adopted into tribal communities and no longer wanted to return to colonial society, while others had died or been killed before exchanges could be arranged. The long-term psychological effects of captivity were severe for those who did return to colonial society. Many former captives had difficulty readjusting to European customs and often felt caught between two cultures, never fully belonging to either. Some chose to return to Native American communities, even when they had the opportunity to remain with their original families. Colonial children who grew up during periods of intensive Indian warfare were profoundly shaped by the experience. They learned to live with constant fear, to be suspicious of strangers, and to view violence as a normal part of life. These attitudes often persisted throughout their lives and were passed on to their own children. The religious implications of Indian warfare were significant for colonial communities. Many colonists interpreted conflicts as religious wars between Christianity and paganism, viewing their enemies as agents of Satan. This religious interpretation sometimes justified extreme violence and made peaceful resolution of conflicts more difficult. Some colonial communities developed early warning systems to alert residents of approaching attacks. These might include signal fires, church bells, or riders who could spread the alarm quickly. However, these systems were often inadequate, and many attacks occurred with little or no warning. The seasonal nature of warfare meant that spring and summer were particularly dangerous times on the frontier. Winter weather made large-scale military operations difficult, but warmer months brought renewed threats as warriors could travel more easily and colonial farmers were working in exposed fields. As colonial populations grew and expanded westward, conflicts with Native American tribes intensified. Each new wave of settlement brought fresh disputes over land and resources, ensuring that warfare remained a constant feature of frontier life throughout the colonial period. The legacy of colonial Indian warfare shaped American attitudes toward Native Americans for generations. The cycle of violence, fear, and mistrust that characterized these conflicts made peaceful coexistence extremely difficult and contributed to the tragic history of Indian-white relations in American history. The brutal realities of Indian warfare were one of the defining characteristics of colonial American life, particularly for those living on the frontier. The constant threat of attack, the horror of captivity, and the cycle of violence and revenge made the colonial frontier one of the most dangerous places in the world during this period. Modern Americans, living in safety and security, can barely imagine the fear and vigilance that characterized daily life for those who lived under the shadow of Indian warfare. The system of justice in colonial America was harsh, arbitrary, and often brutal, reflecting both the desperate need for order in struggling communities and the limited legal traditions that colonists brought from Europe. If you had lived in colonial America, you would have existed under a legal system that could execute you for theft, torture you to extract confessions, and subject you to public humiliation for moral transgressions that would barely be noticed today. Colonial legal systems varied significantly from colony to colony, but they shared common characteristics that made them far more severe than modern American justice. The death penalty was used for numerous crimes that today would be considered minor offenses. Physical punishment was the norm for most criminal convictions. Public humiliation was used both as punishment and deterrent. Due process protections that modern Americans take for granted simply did not exist. The most famous example of colonial justice run amok was the Salem witch trials of 1692-1693 in Massachusetts. These trials demonstrated how quickly colonial legal systems could descend into hysteria, torture, and mass execution. The Salem trials resulted in the deaths of 20 people and the imprisonment of hundreds more, all based on accusations that would be laughable today if they had not led to such tragic consequences. The Salem witch hysteria began when several young girls in Salem village began having fits and claiming they were being tormented by witches. Rather than seeking medical explanations for the girls' behavior, colonial authorities immediately assumed that supernatural forces were at work. The girls began accusing specific individuals of witchcraft, and these accusations were taken seriously by magistrates who had no understanding of psychology or mental illness. The methods used to investigate witchcraft accusations were based on superstition rather than evidence. Suspected witches were subjected to various tests that that were designed to prove their guilt rather than determine their innocence. These tests included searching for devil's marks on their bodies, looking for evidence that they could not recite prayers correctly, and observing whether they floated when thrown into water. Torture was used to extract confessions from accused witches. Suspects were subjected to sleep deprivation, physical abuse, and psychological pressure designed to break their resistance. Many confessed to witchcraft simply to end their suffering, providing detailed accounts of their supposed dealings with the devil that satisfied their interrogators. The trials themselves were a mockery of justice. Accused witches were presumed guilty and had to prove their innocence, which was nearly impossible given the supernatural nature of the charges. Testimony from the afflicted girls was accepted without question, even when it was obviously unreliable or contradictory. Hearsay evidence and rumors were treated as facts. Many of those executed at Salem were respectable members of the community who had no previous criminal records. They were hanged not because they had committed any actual crimes, but because they had been accused by hysterical children and had refused to confess to crimes they hadn't committed. Their deaths demonstrate how quickly colonial justice could turn deadly for innocent people. The witch trials were not unique to Salem, though they were the largest and most famous example. Witch hunts occurred throughout colonial America, and hundreds of people were accused, imprisoned, tortured, and sometimes executed on charges of witchcraft. These cases reveal the superstitious nature of colonial legal thinking and the willingness to use extreme violence against perceived threats to community order. Capital punishment was used extensively throughout colonial America for crimes that modern Americans would consider minor. Theft of goods worth more than a few shillings could result in execution. Adultery was a capital crime in many colonies. Blasphemy, sodomy, and bestiality were all punishable by death. Even children could be executed for serious crimes, though this was relatively rare. The methods of execution used in colonial America were designed to be public spectacles that would deter others from committing crimes. Hanging was the most common method, usually carried out in public squares where large crowds could gather to watch. The condemned person would be forced to stand on a platform with a rope around their neck. Then the platform would be removed, leaving them to strangle slowly as the crowd watched. Public executions were treated as entertainment and moral instruction. Crowds would gather from miles around to witness hangings, which were often preceded by sermons about the consequences of sin and crime. The condemned person was usually allowed to make a final speech, often confessing their crimes and warning others not to follow their example. Other forms of execution included burning at the stake, which was occasionally used for particularly heinous crimes such as witchcraft or treason. This method of execution was extremely painful, with victims often taking many minutes to die as flames consumed their bodies. Some victims were strangled before the fires reached them, but others were burned alive. Physical punishment short of death was the standard penalty for most crimes in colonial America. Whipping was the most common form of corporal punishment, with offenders receiving anywhere from a few lashes to several dozen, depending on the severity of their crimes. These whippings were carried out in public, often at whipping posts located in town squares. The whips used for punishment were designed to inflict maximum pain and damage. They typically had multiple leather strands that would cut into the victim's flesh with each blow. Severe whippings could leave permanent scars and sometimes caused injuries that took weeks or months to heal. Some victims died from infections that developed in their wounds. Branding was used to mark criminals permanently so that their past crimes would be visible to everyone they encountered. Thieves might be branded with a T on their forehead or hand. Adulterers could be branded with an A. These brands were applied with red, hot irons that burn through skin and flesh, leaving permanent scars that identified the bearer as a criminal. The stocks and pillory were used for public humiliation and minor physical punishment. Offenders would be locked into wooden devices that held their heads and hands in fixed positions, unable to move or defend themselves. They would be left in these devices for hours or days while passers-by mocked them, threw rotten food at them, or subjected them to other forms of abuse. Being placed in the stocks or pillory was not just uncomfortable, but also dangerous. Victims were unable to protect themselves from thrown objects, weather, or physical attacks. Some died from exposure when left in these devices during harsh weather. Others suffered permanent injuries from objects thrown by hostile crowds. Cropping or cutting off ears was another form of permanent punishment used for various crimes. This punishment was exactly what it sounds like. One or both of the offender's ears would be cut off with a knife, leaving them permanently disfigured. The severed ears were sometimes nailed to the pillory as a warning to others. Boring through the tongue with a hot iron was used as punishment for lying, blasphemy, or other verbal offenses. A red, hot iron rod would be pushed through the offender's tongue, causing extreme pain and permanent damage that would affect their ability to speak clearly for the rest of their lives. Colonial prisons were not designed for long-term imprisonment, but rather as holding facilities for people awaiting trial or punishment. Conditions in these jails were horrific, with prisoners crowded into small, unheated cells with no sanitation facilities. Many prisoners died from disease, malnutrition, or exposure while awaiting their trials. Prisoners were expected to pay for their own food and accommodations while in jail. Those who couldn't afford these expenses often starved or froze to death. Jailers had no obligation to provide adequate care for prisoners and often treated them brutally. Sexual abuse of female prisoners was common and rarely punished. Debtors' prisons were used to confine people who owed money and couldn't pay their debts. These institutions created a vicious cycle where people were imprisoned for being poor, then became even poorer because they couldn't work while imprisoned. Many debtors died in prison, never able to earn enough money to pay their debts and secure their freedom. The legal procedures used in colonial courts provided few protections for accused persons. There was no right to an attorney for most defendants, no protection against self-incrimination, and no requirement that guilt be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Judges often acted as both prosecutors and decision makers, making fair trials nearly impossible. Evidence standards were much looser than they are today. Hearsay evidence was commonly accepted, and accusations were often treated as proof of guilt. In cases involving moral crimes, such as adultery or fornication, pregnancy outside marriage was considered conclusive evidence of guilt, even if the accused woman claimed she had been raped. Torture to extract confessions was not officially sanctioned in most colonies, but it was sometimes used informally by local magistrates and law enforcement officials. Suspects might be subjected to sleep deprivation, physical abuse, or psychological pressure designed to force them to confess to crimes. The treatment of servants and slaves under colonial law was particularly harsh. Masters had almost unlimited authority over their servants and slaves, and abuse was rarely punished. Servants who tried to escape could have years added to their terms of service. Slaves who committed crimes against whites faced penalties that were much more severe than those imposed on white criminals. Women faced particular disadvantages under colonial legal systems. They had few legal rights and were generally considered the property of their fathers or husbands. Women accused of crimes often faced harsher punishment than men, particularly for moral offenses such as adultery or having children outside marriage. Infanticide was a relatively common crime among colonial women, often committed by unmarried servants who would face severe punishment and social ostracism if their pregnancies were discovered. Women convicted of infanticide were usually executed, often after being subjected to torture to extract confessions. Colonial authorities were particularly harsh in their treatment of sexual crimes and moral offenses. Adultery, fornication, sodomy, and other sexual behaviors that violated community moral standards were severely punished. These prosecutions were often based on community gossip and suspicion rather than concrete evidence. The punishment for adultery could include public whipping, branding, being forced to wear identifying letters on clothing, and sometimes death. Couples caught in adultery might both be punished, though women often received harsher sentences than men for the same offense. Blasphemy laws were strictly enforced in many colonies, particularly those founded by Puritan communities. Speaking against God, questioning religious authority or expressing unorthodox religious views could result in fines, physical punishment, or even death. These laws were used to enforce religious conformity and suppress dissent. Sumptuary laws regulated what people could wear, eat, and how they could behave in public. These laws were designed to maintain social hierarchies and prevent people from living above their assigned social stations. Violations could result in fines, public humiliation, or physical punishment. The colonial legal system was also used to enforce racial hierarchies and control the behavior of non-white populations. Free blacks faced numerous legal restrictions on their movements, occupations, and activities. Native Americans were often denied access to colonial courts and faced severe penalties for crimes against whites. Colonial courts were often corrupt, with judges and other officials taking bribes or using their positions for personal gain. Justice could sometimes be purchased by those with sufficient wealth and influence, while the poor faced the full harshness of colonial law. Appeals processes were limited or non-existent in many colonial legal systems. Once a local magistrate had made a decision, there were often no higher authorities to review the case or correct obvious errors. This meant that arbitrary or corrupt decisions could not be challenged or overturned. The influence of religion on colonial law was pervasive. Biblical law was often used as the basis for colonial legal codes, and clergy frequently served as judges or advisors to courts. This religious influence contributed to the harsh punishment of moral crimes and the acceptance of practices like witch trials. Colonial legal systems gradually evolved over time, becoming somewhat less harsh and arbitrary as colonial societies matured and developed more sophisticated legal institutions. However, throughout the colonial period, justice remained brutal, unequal, and often deadly for those unfortunate enough to be accused of crimes. The legacy of colonial justice shaped American legal development for generations. Many of the constitutional protections that Americans take for granted today, such as the right to an attorney, protection against cruel and unusual punishment, and due process rights, were developed specifically to prevent the kind of legal abuses that were common in colonial America. Understanding the realities of colonial justice helps explain why the American legal system eventually developed such strong protections for accused persons. The founders of the American Republic had direct experience with legal systems that could torture, maim, and kill people for minor offenses or based on flimsy evidence. The Bill of Rights and other constitutional protections were designed to prevent such abuses from recurring. As we continue examining other aspects of colonial life, remember that the threat of brutal legal punishment hung over every colonial American. Any minor transgression, any accusation by a neighbor, any suspicion of improper behavior could result in public humiliation, physical torture, or death. The comfortable assumption of legal protection that modern Americans enjoy was completely unknown to the colonial population. Daily life in colonial America was a constant struggle for survival that required enormous amounts of physical labor, careful planning, and good fortune just to secure the basic necessities of food, shelter, and clothing. If you had lived in colonial America, your entire day would have been consumed by tasks that modern Americans never have to think about. And failure in any of these essential activities could mean death for you and your entire family. The most fundamental challenge facing colonial Americans was securing adequate food. Unlike modern Americans who can obtain food simply by visiting a store, colonial Americans had to grow, hunt, gather, preserve, and prepare virtually everything they ate. This process required extensive knowledge, back-breaking labor, and careful management of resources throughout the year. Colonial farming was primitive by modern standards, relying entirely on human and animal labor with simple hand tools. Colonists had to clear land by cutting down trees with axes and removing stumps by hand, a process that could take years to complete for even small fields. The work was exhausting and dangerous, with many farmers injured or killed by falling trees, sharp tools, or working accidents. Once land was cleared, it had to be prepared for planting by breaking up the soil with primitive plows pulled by oxen or horses. These plows were crude wooden implements that barely scratched the surface of the soil compared to modern farming equipment. Farmers had to go over the same ground many times to prepare it adequately for planting. Planting was done entirely by hand, with farmers walking through their fields, dropping seeds into holes made with simple tools. This process was slow and labor-intensive, requiring perfect timing to take advantage of favorable weather and growing seasons. A late spring or early frost could destroy an entire year's work. Colonial farmers had no access to chemical fertilizers, pesticides, or herbicides. They had to rely on animal manure and crop rotation to maintain soil fertility, and they had to remove weeds by hand throughout the growing season. Insects and plant diseases could destroy crops with no effective means of prevention or treatment. Harvesting was done entirely by hand using sickles, scythes, and other simple tools. Farmers had to cut grain stalks one by one, then gather them into bundles for drying and threshing. This work was exhausting and had to be completed quickly before weather could damage the crop or before it became overripe and lost nutritional value. Food preservation was essential for survival, but extremely difficult without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques. Colonial families had to preserve enough food during the growing season to last through winter and spring when fresh food was not available. Failure to preserve adequate food meant starvation. Meat preservation required smoking, salting, or drying techniques that were time-consuming and often unreliable. Meat had to be processed immediately after animals were slaughtered. working quickly to prevent spoilage. The process required large amounts of salt, which was expensive and sometimes unavailable in frontier areas. Vegetables and fruits were preserved through drying, pickling, or root cellar storage. These methods required careful attention to detail and proper conditions to prevent spoilage. Much preserved food spoiled anyway, leaving families with inadequate nutrition during long winter months. Grain storage required protection from rodents, insects, and moisture that could ruin entire harvests. Colonial families had to build secure storage facilities and constantly monitor their grain supplies for signs of infestation or spoilage. A single mistake in storage could mean the loss of a family's entire food supply. Cooking was a time-consuming and dangerous process that required constant attention to open fires. Colonial women spent hours each day preparing meals over wood, burning fires that could easily burn down houses or cause serious injuries. Burns were common and often fatal due to lack of medical treatment. Water procurement and management was another daily challenge. Colonial families had to locate reliable water sources, dig wells by hand, and maintain water supplies that were often contaminated with bacteria, parasites, or other harmful substances. Many colonial Americans died from waterborne diseases caused by contaminated drinking water. Wells had to be dug entirely by hand, often to depths of 30 feet or more to reach clean water. This work was dangerous, with cave-ins and gas poisoning claiming the lives of well diggers. Even successful wells required constant maintenance to prevent contamination and ensure continued water supply. Water had to be carried by hand from wells or streams to homes, often over considerable distances. A typical colonial family needed dozens of gallons of water each day for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and other necessities. Carrying this water was exhausting work that fell primarily to women and children. Shelter construction and maintenance required skills that most modern Americans don't possess, and tools that were primitive by modern standards. Colonial families had to build their own homes using only hand tools and materials they could gather or produce themselves. House construction began with cutting down trees and preparing timber using hand tools. This process required extensive knowledge of woodworking and construction techniques that had to be learned through experience. Mistakes in construction could result in houses that were unsafe, uncomfortable, or unable to withstand harsh weather. Colonial homes were built without modern insulation, heating systems, or weatherproofing. Families had to maintain fires constantly during winter months, requiring enormous amounts of firewood that had to be cut, split, and hauled by hand. Many colonial Americans died from exposure in their own homes during harsh winters. Maintenance of colonial homes required constant attention and repair work. Roofs leaked, walls developed gaps that let in cold air, and foundations settled or shifted. Families had to perform all repair work themselves, using primitive tools and limited materials. Clothing production was another enormous challenge that required specialized skills and enormous amounts of time. Colonial families had to produce virtually all their own clothing from raw materials, a process that could take months or years to complete. Cloth production began with growing flax or raising sheep to produce raw materials. Flax had to be harvested, processed through multiple stages to extract fibers, and then spun into thread using spinning wheels. Sheep had to be sheared, and their wool had to be cleaned, carded, and spun into yarn. Spinning thread and yarn was time-consuming work that fell primarily to women and girls. A colonial woman might spend several hours each day spinning, working by firelight in winter months when daylight hours were short. The thread and yarn produced were often irregular and of poor quality compared to modern standards. Weaving cloth required specialized equipment and skills that not all colonial families possessed. Those who didn't own looms had to trade with neighbors or do without new cloth. The weaving process was slow and labor-intensive, producing small quantities of rough cloth that had to be carefully managed and conserved. Sewing clothing by hand required extensive skill and enormous amounts of time. A single garment might take weeks or months to complete, working by candlelight or firelight with crude needles and thread. Most colonial Americans owned only a few items of clothing that had to last for years. Clothing repair was a constant necessity as colonial Americans had to make their limited clothing last as long as possible. Patches, darning, and other repair techniques were essential skills that could extend the life of garments that were expensive and difficult to replace. Fuel procurement for heating and cooking required enormous amounts of physical labor throughout the year. Colonial families used vast quantities of firewood that had to be cut, split, and hauled by hand. This work was dangerous and exhausting, but absolutely essential for survival. Tree cutting was done with axes and hand saws, requiring strength, skill, and careful attention to safety. Many colonial Americans were injured or killed in logging accidents, crushed by falling trees, or struck by flying wood chips. The work was so strenuous that it could only be done for short periods before rest was required. Wood splitting required additional time and effort to prepare firewood for burning. Logs had to be split into smaller pieces that would fit in fireplaces and burn efficiently. This work was usually done with wedges and mauls, requiring precise technique to avoid injury and efficiently process large quantities of wood. Hauling firewood from cutting areas to homes required enormous physical effort, especially in winter when snow and ice made transportation difficult. Families needed several cords of wood each year, representing tons of material that had to be moved by hand or with simple sleds and carts. Tool maintenance was another essential skill that colonial Americans had to master. All tools were made by hand and required constant maintenance keep them sharp and functional. Blacksmithing skills were essential for repairing and maintaining metal tools that were expensive and difficult to replace. Personal hygiene was difficult to maintain without modern sanitation facilities, soap, or understanding of disease transmission. Most colonial Americans rarely bathed, wore the same clothing for extended periods, and lived in conditions that would be considered unsanitary by modern standards. Soap production was a complex process that required materials that were often difficult to obtain. Colonial families had to save animal fat and wood ash throughout the year to make soap in large batches that had to last for months. The soap production process was dangerous, involving caustic chemicals that could cause serious burns. Waste disposal was another major challenge without modern sewage systems or garbage collection. Colonial families had to manage human waste, food scraps, and other garbage in ways that wouldn't contaminate their water supplies or attract dangerous animals and insects. Latrines had to be dug by hand and regularly cleaned or relocated to prevent contamination of wells and living areas. This work was unpleasant and potentially dangerous, as poorly managed waste disposal could lead to disease outbreaks that could kill entire families. Time management was critical for colonial families, who had to accomplish numerous essential tasks within the limited daylight hours available. There was no electric lighting, so most work had to be completed during daylight or by the dim light of candles and oil lamps that were expensive and dangerous. Seasonal planning required extensive knowledge and careful preparation to ensure that families would have adequate resources throughout the year. Spring planting, summer cultivation, fall harvesting, and winter preservation activities all had to be timed correctly and executed efficiently to ensure family survival. Colonial Americans had to develop extensive knowledge of weather patterns, seasonal changes, and local conditions that affected all aspects of daily life. This knowledge was acquired through experience and passed down through generations, but mistakes in timing or planning could be fatal. The physical demands of colonial life were enormous, requiring strength, endurance, and skills that most modern Americans don't possess. Colonial Americans worked on a dusk performing physically demanding tasks that would exhaust modern people within hours. Women in colonial America faced all the same survival challenges as men, while also bearing primary responsibility for domestic tasks, childcare, and often assistance with farming and other outdoor work. Colonial women were among the hardest working people in human history, performing essential tasks that required both physical strength and specialized skills. Children in colonial America were put to work at early ages, contributing to family survival through age-appropriate tasks that gradually prepared them for adult responsibilities. Childhood, as modern Americans understand, it simply didn't exist for most colonial children who had to work to help their families survive. Education was a luxury that few colonial families could afford, as children's time was needed for essential survival tasks. Most colonial Americans were illiterate and had limited knowledge beyond what was necessary for their immediate survival needs. Medical emergencies were particularly dangerous in colonial America, where families had to treat injuries and illnesses with limited knowledge and no access to professional medical care. Many colonial Americans died from conditions that would be easily treatable today. The social aspects of survival required cooperation with neighbors and community members for tasks that were too large or complex for individual families to handle alone. Barn raisings, harvesting assistance, and other cooperative activities were essential for community survival. Trade and barter were necessary for obtaining goods and services that families couldn't produce themselves. Colonial Americans had to develop trading relationships and negotiation skills to obtain essential items like salt, metal tools, and other manufactured goods. Transportation was difficult and dangerous, limiting colonial Americans' ability to obtain supplies, seek help during emergencies, or maintain contact with distant family members. Most travel was done on foot or horseback over rough trails that were dangerous and time-consuming to navigate. The psychological stress of colonial survival was enormous, as families lived with constant uncertainty about their ability to secure basic necessities. The knowledge that failure in any essential task could mean death for the entire family created anxiety and stress that affected every aspect of daily life. Despite all these challenges, colonial Americans developed remarkable skills and resilience that enabled them to survive and eventually thrive in their harsh environment. The comfortable life that modern Americans enjoy was built on the foundation of their struggle and sacrifice. Though most of them died without ever experiencing the security and prosperity that their descendants would eventually achieve. Understanding the daily survival challenges faced by colonial Americans helps explain why life expectancy was so low and why so many colonial settlements failed completely. The margin for error was extremely small, and any combination of bad weather, crop failure, disease, or other problems could quickly lead to starvation and death. The few colonial families who achieved prosperity and security did so only after years or decades of struggle that would be unimaginable to modern Americans. Their success was built on the foundation of enormous amounts of physical labor, careful planning, good fortune, and often the deaths of less fortunate neighbors whose failures provided object lessons in the consequences of mistakes. As we conclude our examination of colonial American life, remember that every aspect of daily existence was a struggle for survival that required constant effort and vigilance. The comfortable assumptions about food, shelter, clothing, and security that modern Americans take for granted were luxuries completely unknown to the vast majority of colonial Americans, who lived and died in conditions of hardship that tested the limits of human endurance. As we reach the end of our journey through the brutal realities of colonial American life, it's important to reflect on just how miraculous your comfortable modern existence truly is. Every convenience you take for granted, every security you assume, every comfort you enjoy represents a dramatic improvement over the daily struggle for survival that characterized life in colonial America. When you wake up in your comfortable bed this morning, in a home that maintains a perfect temperature, regardless of the weather outside, you are experiencing a level of comfort that would have seemed like an impossible dream to colonial Americans who died of exposure in their own homes during harsh winters. Your mattress, your pillows, your warm blankets, your controlled indoor climate represent luxuries beyond the imagination of people who slept on straw mats in drafty, smoky hovels. When you turn on a light switch and illuminate your room with safe, bright electric lighting, you are performing an act that would have seemed like magic to colonial Americans who lived most of their lives in darkness or by the dim, dangerous light of candles and oil lamps. The simple ability to see clearly at any hour of the day or night represents a freedom that colonial Americans never experienced. When you walk to your kitchen and turn on a faucet to obtain clean, safe drinking water, you are accessing a resource that millions of colonial Americans died trying to secure. The knowledge that your water is free from deadly bacteria, parasites, and contamination represents a security that colonial families never enjoyed, even when they spent hours each day hauling water from distant wells and streams. When you open your refrigerator or pantry and select from an abundant variety of fresh, preserved, and prepared foods, you are exercising choices that would have been incomprehensible to colonial Americans who spent most of their time desperately searching for adequate calories to survive another day. The knowledge that you will have enough to eat, that your food is safe and nutritious, that you can obtain whatever type of food you desire represents a prosperity that even the wealthiest colonial Americans rarely achieved. When you take a hot shower or bath with soap and clean towels, you are enjoying a level of cleanliness and hygiene that was impossible for colonial Americans who might bathe only a few times per year and who lived with constant infestations of lice, fleas, and other parasites. Your daily cleanliness routines represent a standard of living that would have seemed luxurious beyond belief to people who wore the same clothes for months and who had no effective means of cleaning themselves or their possessions. When you put on clean, well-fitting clothes that were manufactured by machines in factories and purchased in stores, you are wearing garments that represent months or years of work by colonial standards. The average modern American owns more clothing than entire colonial families possessed, and your clothes are of better quality, more comfortable, and more durable than anything colonial Americans could produce with their primitive hand tools and techniques. When you take medicine for a headache, apply antibiotic ointment to a cut, or visit a doctor for medical care, you are accessing medical resources that could have saved millions of colonial American lives. The simple knowledge that minor injuries won't become infected, that diseases can be treated effectively, that medical help is available when needed represents a security that colonial Americans never experienced. When you travel safely in an automobile over paved roads, protected by traffic laws and emergency services, you are moving through the world with a speed and safety that would have astonished colonial Americans who walked everywhere and for whom travel was always dangerous and often deadly. Your ability to travel hundreds of miles in complete safety represents a freedom that colonial Americans couldn't imagine. When you communicate instantly with people around the world through telephones, computers, and internet connections, you are accessing information and social connections that colonial Americans could never have conceived. The simple ability to know what is happening in other places, to maintain contact with distant friends and family, to access unlimited information and entertainment represents capabilities that would have seemed supernatural to colonial Americans. When you live without fear of Indian raids, witch trials, public executions, or arbitrary punishment by corrupt officials, you are enjoying legal protections and personal security that colonial Americans died fighting to achieve. The knowledge that you are safe in your home, that you won't be falsely accused of crimes, that you have legal rights and protections represents freedoms that colonial Americans could only dream of achieving. When you assume that your children will live to adulthood, receive education, and have opportunities to build successful lives, you are taking for granted outcomes that most colonial American parents never witnessed. The expectation that families will remain intact, that children will outlive their parents, that future generations will be more prosperous than previous ones represents hopes that colonial Americans rarely saw fulfilled. Your life expectancy of 75 to 80 years represents a lifespan that was achieved by only a tiny percentage of colonial Americans. Most colonial Americans died before age 40, many in childhood, and few lived long enough to see their grandchildren reach adulthood. Your expectation of a long, healthy life represents a gift that colonial Americans could never count on receiving. The education you received, the books you can read, the knowledge you can access represents intellectual opportunities that were available to almost no colonial Americans. Most colonial Americans were illiterate and had access to few books or sources of information beyond what was necessary for immediate survival. Your ability to learn about any subject that interests you represents possibilities that colonial Americans couldn't even imagine. The leisure time you enjoy, the entertainment you can access, the hobbies you can pursue represent luxuries that colonial Americans never experienced. Every colonial American's time was consumed by the essential tasks of survival, leaving no opportunity for the recreational activities that modern Americans take for granted. The social mobility you possess, the career choices available to you, the opportunity to determine your own future represents freedoms that were denied to most colonial Americans who were trapped by circumstances of birth, economic necessity, and social restrictions. Your ability to choose your own path in life represents possibilities that colonial Americans rarely had the luxury of considering. The safety and security of your neighborhood, the knowledge that help is available if you need it, the assumption that your property and person are protected by law represents a level of social order that colonial Americans rarely experienced. Your ability to live without constant fear of violence, theft, or attack represents a security that colonial Americans spent their entire lives trying to achieve. Yet despite all these advantages, despite living in conditions that would seem like paradise to colonial Americans, many modern Americans still find reasons for complaint, dissatisfaction, and unhappiness. This isn't a criticism of modern life, but rather a recognition of how quickly human beings adapt to improved conditions and begin to take even miraculous improvements for granted. The colonial Americans who die from starvation would be amazed by modern Americans who worry about their weight. Those who died from exposure would be astonished by modern Americans who complain about minor temperature variations in their climate-controlled homes. Those who died from preventable diseases would be stunned by modern Americans who take their good health for granted. This isn't to say that modern Americans shouldn't strive for continued improvement or shouldn't address the problems and challenges that still exist, but understanding the brutal realities of colonial life helps put modern problems in perspective and reminds us of how much progress has been achieved in just a few centuries. The comfortable life you live today was built on the foundation of colonial American suffering and sacrifice. Every colonial American who died from disease contributed to the eventual development of modern medicine. Every colonial American who starved contributed to the eventual development of modern agriculture and food distribution systems. Every colonial American who suffered from violence contributed to the eventual development of modern legal and social institutions. Their deaths were not in vain if we remember their sacrifice and appreciate the miraculous improvements that their struggle made possible. The prosperity, security, and freedom that modern Americans enjoy were purchased with the lives of colonial Americans who died without experiencing these benefits themselves. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your safe, comfortable bed, remember the countless colonial Americans who died cold, hungry, and afraid in the wilderness they tried to tame. Their struggle and suffering made your comfortable life possible. Their failures and successes taught the lessons that eventually led to modern American prosperity. You are living the dreams that colonial Americans died pursuing. Your ordinary day contains luxuries that colonial Americans couldn't imagine. Your routine complaints about minor inconveniences would seem ridiculous to people who fought desperately just to survive another day. The gap between colonial American life and modern American life represents one of the most dramatic improvements in human living conditions in all of history. In just a few centuries, American life has been transformed from a desperate struggle for survival into an existence of unprecedented comfort, security, and opportunity. This transformation wasn't inevitable or automatic. It required the sacrifice of generations of Americans who lived and died under brutal conditions, while slowly building the foundations for modern prosperity. Their struggles with disease led to medical advances. Their struggles with starvation led to agricultural improvements. Their struggles with violence led to better legal and social institutions. Every aspect of modern American life represents a victory over the forces that killed colonial Americans. Every modern convenience represents a problem solved, often at great cost in human suffering. Every modern freedom represents a hard-won achievement that previous generations died fighting to secure. Sleep well tonight. Listeners, you are living a life that represents the fulfillment of colonial American dreams, the answer to colonial American prayers, the reward for colonial American sacrifice. Your comfortable existence is the greatest tribute you can offer to the memory of those who died in the brutal struggle to build the foundation of American civilization. Sweet dreams, descendant of survivors. You are the miracle that colonial Americans died hoping their sacrifice would someday make possible. Your peaceful sleep represents their ultimate victory over the harsh conditions that killed so many of them. Rest well in the comfort and security that they could never achieve, but never stopped fighting to create for future generations.